Hello, everybody. Oliver G here. This is the Earful Tower podcast, and I know a lot of people are coming to Paris with plans of everything they want to do for every hour of their day, but this episode is more about Paris if you want to roll with it. Paris if you want to experience the real city. Paris if you want to see how locals live. Who better to speak to than Scott Carpenter, aka Scott Carpenter, aka the author of the new book, Paris, Lost and Found, a memoir of love. He's from the Midwest. He's a lovely man. I just read his book, enjoyed it a lot. We're going to be talking about life in this city when you're more of a local, and if you're not a local, how you can go about achieving that sense of this magnificent city. I'll leave you with some music from Press Maxon, and then we're going to get into the podcast. A huge thanks to the Patreon members who make this show possible. I'll be back at the end with a few more words of how you can join them. But first, here comes Scott Carpenter. Scott Carpenter, welcome to the studio. How you doing?
I'm doing fine. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for coming in here. I'm going to own it straight away. A lot of things have gone wrong before we pressed record. You've been very gracious and kind on me, I must say.
Well, I think that's one of the things we'll talk about, what to do when things go a little bit wrong and how to turn that to your advantage.
That's a great segue already. Is that also this sort of, you could have really just told me to get lost and walked out of here. Is that a Midwestern sort of friendliness or something going on here?
There could be a little bit of that. People talk about Minnesota nice, but it's also just some learned skills about how to take advantage when things go a little bit haywire.
Right. Is that does that mesh well with Paris and Parisians?
Oh, well, yes and no. I think Parisians don't lend themselves to this, but I think it actually does help people when they're trying to get a Paris experience, learning how to roll with things a little and not always going to plan.
Can we focus on that for a little, I think?
Sure.
Rolling with it, going with the plan. I want to focus on it, but first I want to give your sort of credentials here, because even reading the book, it wasn't exactly clear how long you've been, like how many months you've called Paris home, that you've been here, for example.
Wow. So it's a hard question. I've been coming to Paris since I was 10 years old, and sometimes I'm here for a year, sometimes I'm here for 6 months. This year it's about 5 months, I guess.
So what does it average out? And how old are you?
Average is probably 3 or 4 months out of the year.
Okay.
I consider Paris my second home.
Okay. So all in all, that's an awful long time. I've been here 10 years straight. Do you topple me in the months?
If we were to tally it all up, I think it'd be comparable, probably.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
I noticed as well, I heard you speaking with someone outside, your French sounds very good. Even reading the book, I noticed some of the, because often when people write these kind of books about Paris, you sense they might be faking it with the stories. Do you know what I mean?
Right, yeah.
Yeah, they're sort of telling little anecdotes and stuff. And some of your anecdotes in the book, I was like, this guy's got an advanced French here, I thought. That was my vibe.
Well, I've taught French for a long time. I've got I was exposed to it pretty early, so I was dipped into French the way that Obélix was dipped into the magic potion in the Asterix comics.
What was that word from the hardware store?
Aigre du culot was the way that I wrote it out, which doesn't exist in any language, but it was supposed to be some sort of an écrou, which is kind of a nut that goes onto a part of the toilet that I was looking for.
That was a lot of this was really relatable to me, this book. Even just that, I remember in my early days in Paris trying to get a hammer from the shop, and I was like, you start, and you certainly can relate to this, you start talking to someone about something, you even have a whole chapter about this kind of faking it. Yeah. And I started asking this guy for the hammer, and then as I get to the noun at the end of the sentence, I was like, I don't know that word in French. And then I started mimicking hammer, Yeah. I think that's a really good way to learn the language, though, don't you think?
It is. You just have to jump in. I think we also do that in our native tongue. We all think that if we're an English speaker, we think that we speak English perfectly, but nobody does, right? So we're mostly mastered by the languages that we speak. Yeah. And in French, we're a little bit more self-conscious about it because we've come to it a little belatedly. Maybe our deficits are a little bit greater. Yeah. But you start throwing yourself into the language and you're tooling along really well, and then you get to the very end and you're missing that crucial part.
Yeah, the noun for me.
For example.
Yeah. What do you think about that? The thing that people say you have different personalities in different languages.
I think that's true,
Yeah.
right? So just as we have different accents when we're speaking one language or another, our personalities are accented in a certain way.
Yeah.
So French is more of a sing-songy language, so you end up being a little bit more animated when you speak. The way that humor operates in French is different, so you suddenly have to adjust your sense of humor. There are all sorts of ways in which I think we adapt to the culture that we find ourselves in, and it shapes our personality.
I find I'm not funny in French at all. I try and be funny in English. You know, it's I think about it. Like, that's part of my personality, whether
Right.
I am or not, I think it. And then in French, zero. It doesn't work. Do you have that kind of thing as well?
Well, it's a different sort of sense of humor.
Yeah.
And one of the things is that French humor is often either very slapsticky or else it's very linguistic. And
know,
a
yeah.
lot of people end up, like the first time they make a joke in French and it goes over, they remember that for the rest of their life.
Yeah.
But it's this big breakthrough.
Yeah. Isn't that interesting? Because if it is language skill related, for anyone who's coming here trying to learn the language, that's going to be really out of reach for perhaps forever.
Yeah, I don't actually agree with that. I think that sometimes there are very simple things that you can play with in the language.
Teach me. Some.
Yeah. What am I going to have to tell you there? I mean, I think of when I was learning Danish, for example, and I had a handful of words, and I went to the bank, and one of the things you say in Denmark is thanks 1,000 times, and I was getting
Tusind
out.
tak.
Yeah, exactly. And I was actually taking out 2,000 kroners,
Yeah.
and they gave it to me, and I said, 2,000 tak.
There
So
you go.
2,000 thanks.
Very good.
Yeah.
Very good.
Even with very rudimentary skills, you can sometimes pull it off.
I can learn from you, Scott. I can see it. Now, do you see? I'm sure there's someone at home thinking Oliver said he was going to focus on the rolling with it, but what I've done is I rolled with the conversation for a little bit. But let's flip that into Paris and even winding in your book here. The idea of experiencing this city as a local is really, I think, you got to get beyond those Eiffel Tower-y, Musée d'Orsay, I know a lot of locals visit, but certainly, for example, the Eiffel Tower, like a lot of locals here wouldn't dream of going up there. I was talking to some people who've lived here 15 years last night, and they still haven't been up to the top level of it.
Right.
Yeah, but living like a local is sort of getting involved in it, rolling with it, not planning out everything. How does that shape your many months and years in this city?
Great question. So the Eiffel Tower is always a good place to start, right? It's the icon of the city. Everybody knows it. But you're right that for a lot of locals, it's not so much the Eiffel Tower, it's the Awful Tower, right? It's sometimes considered an eyesore, or at best, it's a great sort of landmark when you're driving. Am I headed west or am I going north? Oh, there's the Eiffel Tower. I know which way I'm going.
Sure.
That sort of thing. But as a thing to visit, not so much. And I think when people are coming to Paris for the first time or the second or the fifth time, they often have a list of things that they want to go and see, and they're listed in order of priority. So they've got this great plan of everything that they need to get to. But in my experience, one of the really great things is to get a little bit off plan. And so it's good to tick a few of those things off, and they're really wonderful things to visit. Sometimes things that, as you say, the locals don't really go to. But to experience it as a local, sometimes you need to set that aside and let life kind of wash over you.
Is that something that came to you fairly quickly in your Paris years, that idea of just chilling out and going with it?
I think it came to me from living in France for the very first time and finding that things would go wrong and I would have to deal with them. And while this would ordinarily be a kind of a frustration for me, more and more they turned into small adventures. So I find myself rubbing my hands together with a certain amount of perverse glee when something goes wrong, or I get off the track, or I get a little bit lost, because it's going to lead to something, and that something is usually unexpected. And I think that's what makes Paris the city of surprises, which is the opposite of a plan, right? When you have a plan, you go, nobody arrives in Paris and goes to the Louvre and says, wow, look at that. I didn't expect to see the Mona Lisa. Right? That's not a surprise. But there are a lot of other things that are surprises that you can sort of help to coax into existence.
I want to get into that as well, but I'm curious. I think you and I might have this in common, that when things go wrong and you're rubbing your hands together in glee, it's because you're a storyteller as well, don't you think?
Yeah, I think there's a certain amount of that, but I also just like complications.
But why? That doesn't make sense. I've got to dissect this a little bit. I mean, do you, in your personal life, Do you find yourself telling the stories of these things going wrong and enjoying telling that to people? Or knowing that, like tucking it away later for writing in a book? Or
I do like them because they're stories. That's certainly true. But I also like them just because they help to lift the lid a little bit on the culture. I'm much more tolerant of things going wrong in France than I am, for example, in Minneapolis or St. Paul. When I'm at home, I want things to go smoothly. When they don't go smoothly, I find myself getting a little bit irritated. And here, something goes wrong, and I think either this is just going to be a problem, or it's going wrong because there's something I didn't understand culturally, and that's going to reveal something
it's like
to
you
me.
can solve something along the way.
Right.
Yeah, it can unlock more of the city that clearly is so important to you.
That's the hope.
Yeah. How did that happen, by the way? I know in your book you talk about spending time outside of Paris. It almost seemed like a reluctance to want to come to Paris.
That's also true. So I came to Paris for the first time as a school kid and didn't really enjoy it.
10 years old. Yeah.
10 years old. And
the nuances are lost on a 10-year-old, I think.
I think they are. You experience the city in different ways.
Yeah.
And one of the things that you find is that you're sitting in like a relatively cheap hotel with cockroaches under the bread baskets. And, that's the kind of wildlife that you're interested in. And you're not so keen on some of the monuments.
Yeah.
But I did find Paris a hard city to warm up to, and I spent a lot of time in the provinces before gradually coming here, and it was mostly because Paris is kind of like a bathtub drain. Everything eventually sort of ends up here. And so I had friends who were moving to Paris for jobs and other things, and then eventually my own work brought me to Paris, and was not quite brought here kicking and screaming, but a little bit reluctantly. And then had that sort of turning point and discovered the marvels of the city.
Can you pinpoint that to something specific, or was that in your first book that I haven't read yet?
So there are some stories in the first book that are sort of representative of this, but I think for me, one of the biggest turning points was when I first came to Paris with kids.
Right.
And when you're here with kids, there are all sorts of problems, as you know, right? So you don't maybe yet have kids in school, do you?
Just this week, yes.
Yeah, just this week. So getting kids enrolled in school and trying to figure out exactly how the schooling is going to work and going to the town hall to get all the paperwork done and all of these things. Suddenly your life is just complicated to the nth degree.
Yeah.
And it has to be done, right? So you're doing it for your kids. You have to do it more or less successfully. And I think that was when I felt this kind of density of difficulty where I felt incredibly accomplished when I succeeded at one of these tasks.
Interesting. That's interesting. There's some, I don't remember the quote, but there's something from Gertrude Stein about being comfortable in a different country or a different language, about you sort of like you've achieved something. Does this ring a bell to you? There's some.
Yeah, very vaguely.
I can't
finish that quote for you.
Wouldn't it be better if one of us could?
Right.
But I can relate to that as well. I feel like I can relate to a lot of. I could read your whole life story and see where mine's going to go. Maybe. Did you move here more or less when the kids were school age?
Yeah, so going back and forth, we would come for a year, we'd be gone, for the better part of a year, then we'd be back for a year or so, going back and forth, and the kids had their schooling in both places.
Right. There's I know I talked to a lot of people who are coming to Paris, come for the first time, maybe similar to you, and other characters in your book maybe don't love it straight away. That idea of the hidden surprises, rolling with it, as we said, there are people who want to plan out every second of their Paris trip. Right. People who are listening to us now who are coming to Paris for the first, second, third time, and it frightens them to leave a day blank. How can you convince people that it's worth doing?
First of all, I should say that I sympathize with that desire, right? It is risky to suddenly leave gaps in your schedule. You're afraid that you're going to miss something. You're afraid that something might happen that you don't want to have happen. But I really would encourage people to embrace that. One of the things that happens is that if everything is planned to a T, you may see all of the things that you want to see. And it's easy to have that kind of list because Paris is the one city that everybody knows before they come here, right? Nobody comes to Paris without having seen the Eiffel Tower. They probably have like a Mona Lisa fridge magnet. They've had all sorts of references to Paris and the city of romance and the city of elegance, and they're watching Emily in Paris. So they have this idea of what Paris really is, and they come and they have a list of things that they want to see almost as if to confirm their idea of it. And that is totally understandable. What it doesn't allow you to do is leave space for the Paris that you don't expect. And so if you leave a day open or a half day open in your planning and just head out and get a little bit lost, I can guarantee you that something is going to happen that would not otherwise have happened.
The thing that you're going to go home and tell your friends about, probably.
In fact, it's often the most memorable stuff.
Yeah.
And it's because you get off the beaten track and you're not having the same experience as everybody else.
Yeah.
You have a personal experience.
Yeah.
I sometimes tell people that the best thing to do is to hop on a bus. And everybody's taking the metro. The metro is very easy to use. Hop onto a bus. You're able to see many things. You also probably don't really know where the bus is going, which is fine.
And sometimes the bus doesn't seem to know where it's going.
That's also true.
When the roads close or whatever, they just try something.
Suddenly they're going off in odd directions.
Yeah.
And so you live this kind of adventure. You don't know where you're going, but you end up somewhere. And that somewhere is almost always going to be somewhat surprising.
Yeah.
And then you take the bus back. There are other ways that you can, in a sense, metaphorically, hop onto the bus. Right? You could just hop into some sort of an experience. You go down this street, you go down that street. Somebody speaks to you in a shop, and you continue the conversation. Somebody recommends something to you at the cafe that you've never had before, and you ask them about it, and suddenly they're telling you all about cheeses in their home village and things like that. Experiences that you would not be able to plan. Right? They're not plannable in any real way. But they become accessible to you because you opened yourself up. It means making yourself a little bit vulnerable, actually.
Which is probably the most frightening thing for people.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
I understand it.
Yeah. I mean, I love that idea. I agree 100%. Like those open doors, those conversations. If you plan that trip out, which I know is tempting, you plan it out 100%, you might just come back with the exact trip that you planned to have.
Right.
And you might not even have liked it.
Right.
Isn't that a scary thought? Like a lot of people do these. A lot of people, I mean, the Mona Lisa is a great example. A lot of people fear they'll come home and their friends will say, "You saw the Mona Lisa, right?" And if they say, "Oh no, I didn't. I went and spent my day in a different wing of the Louvre."
Right.
Whereas that can really be
the other wings of the Louvre will be more interesting. Almost certainly, I would say that. When people go to see the Mona Lisa, they're in this relatively small room packed in with lots of other people, and you no longer have the intimate experience that you want to with a work of art. So having that intimate experience is, and kind of a really personal experience is what people want and what is so enriching. Whether it's a work of art, whether it's a conversation with a person, whether it's trying to buy an umbrella because your umbrella blew out during a rainstorm and you're suddenly negotiating with a shopkeeper in a little shop just off the Boulevard Saint-Germain. Those are the things that really make it fun and it personalizes your experience.
What about, in your book, a lot of the stories are sort of about fairly everyday things, as in, a problem at the apartment that you live in, or, an encounter with someone on the street. And these aren't stories of you, taking a trip across the Atlantic. These aren't, you know what I mean? They're not huge life events. I mean, some of them certainly are in respect to your wife.
Right.
But this sort of everyday experience, visitors to Paris maybe can't access that kind of stuff. They don't meet their gardienne if they're staying in a hotel, for example. Do you think these are things that people should seek out, perhaps?
Yeah, I mean, I think that they are available to everybody at different levels. It's true that in my particular existence, because I go back and forth, I'm involved in the life of my building. I serve on the building committee.
Why did you want to do that, by the way?
Just because in Paris, it's really hard to get to know people.
Yeah.
So this is relatively well known that social circles in France tend to be very tightly controlled. It's really hard to break in.
Yeah.
And the flip side of it is that once you get in, it's really nearly impossible to break out.
Yeah.
Right? You're friends for life.
Yeah.
But it means that in my building, I have people that I see almost every day, and I have no idea who they are. Unlike the people in the building that I live in when I'm in the States, where everybody's very chatty, it's very congenial. I moved in, and the very first day I knew their names. I knew the names of their dogs, a real kind of American openness. And you don't get that so much when you're in France very easily. But then being able to join the building committee, suddenly I'm part of a team. We're working together. And then we crack that building open a little bit like opening up a dollhouse. And we're able to see all the small dramas that are going on and what needs to be done to help to resolve them.
I wonder if, like, in the States, like, you know, if you compare what you just said with people in the building, it also works on a even more relatable note in, like, restaurants. A waiter in a French restaurant and a waiter in an American restaurant are very different.
That's right.
Similar to what you said with people in your building. And I wonder if there's a sort of facade and emptiness to the American way of saying hello to everybody, getting names, and then maybe not developing it deeper. I don't know America very well. But here, when you earn it, and you, even with a waiter, when you have that little back and forth, and you earn some kind of like relationship with them, it seems to open up a whole new world. What do you think about that?
I think that's right. So in the States, you get somebody marching up to the table. Hi, my name is Jared. I'm your server tonight. How can I help you? And but you're right that in France, it's a little bit colder, a little more distant at first. So
Less
that if there's
superficial, perhaps. Yeah.
Well, if the connection is going to be made, you have to work at it a little bit more.
Yeah.
And part of it, I think, actually has to do with tipping culture.
Sure.
So in the States, people are expected to tip, and that means that the server is more beholden to the customer and needs to be very warm and friendly no matter what happens. And in France, not so much. The tip is built into the price. They're not going to earn more if they're nice to you or not. So they tend to be just more professional, I would say. But then, even then, you can sometimes kind of crack through and have a nice little relationship that does feel more satisfying, I think, because it's been earned.
You know, I once saw a Parisian waiter catch a falling plate of olives.
Oh,
the plate. It was one of the most professional waiter moves I've ever seen in my life. It was so good. I don't know if it had anything to do with being a Parisian waiter or not, but I'll never forget. Just one of those. He was there. Yeah. He could anticipate every need that we had, including when the olives fell.
That's a pro.
Yeah, right. It didn't get better than that. This we talked about a little bit before we pressed record. The little surprises of Paris, and you mentioned something about the architecture as well.
Yeah.
Can we get into that a little bit? You said the city was built.
So. Yes. The kinds of surprises that I'm talking about that have to do just with everyday experience are also reflected in the way that the city is put together. So in the middle of the 19th century, Paris was basically a medieval city, and it was a hodgepodge of small little roads and buildings that were kind of tumbling into the streets. And right in the middle of the century, there was a new government. It was the beginning of the Second Empire, and there was a new initiative to modernize the city. This is when the Baron Haussmann, Haussmann, came to, in a sense, power and was leading the charge on all of these modernizations. Some of it has to do with those big fancy buildings that are lining many of the great boulevards, but it also has to do with the way in which streets cut through the city and the way that they designed various kinds of vistas. So the idea was that the going through the city should be an aesthetic experience. And you can be walking down a little street, and then suddenly you turn the corner, and then, woo, you're in a major boulevard lined with trees, and down at the end there's an opera house or there's a theater. There was this whole idea that there should be something stunning and spectacular to look at. And I think most people who are wandering through Paris would agree that there are many things, that are many small pleasures of looking up and noticing architectural motifs and the way roof lines come together and things like that, but also these big surprises that are really unexpected for the newcomer going through various neighborhoods. So that was part of it was a very deliberate and conscious choice.
And how does that tie to living with the rolling with it attitude?
Well, I think it does show you that if you're wandering through the city, that there are rewards built in. Some of these rewards are big, right? You suddenly turn the corner and you see this marvelous structure. And some of them require that you go into some nooks and crannies. So I was with my partner the other day, and we went to the Bibliothèque Mazarine, which is inside the French Institute, where the Académie Française is lodged. and it's the oldest public library in the city, and it's just a jewel. The reading room is what everybody pictures when they're thinking of the oldest, most elegant sort of library reading rooms. The whole thing is quite spectacular. So you can sometimes hunt out little things like that. They're accessible to everybody. You don't need any special permission to get in.
Free as well.
Yeah, free as well, right? And so there are things like that that are just built in, and I think that too is part of the experience that you can have if you're willing to go, turn to the right, turn to the left, not just follow the path that's straight in front of you, not just follow the shortest route to get to the Musée d'Orsay, but go off a little bit and say, well, what is that thing over there? And let yourself get sidetracked.
Get off at the metro stop before.
Yeah, that's a great
after.
start.
Yeah.
That's a great start.
It sounds a little bit like the way you lived your life with...
It's the way I try to live my life.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I have to admit, like everybody else, sometimes I just want it to be easy. I want things to go the right way.
That's
I don't
what you
want
got
the
the Midwest
surprise.
for, by the sounds of it.
I suppose.
That brings us to your book, Paris Lost and Found. Let's finish on talking about this for a second. Who have you written it for?
Who have I written it for? So I've written it for, I guess, a couple of broad audiences. In the book, I talk about what it's like to be in Paris when life has smacked you down. So I tell the story of my wife, with whom I'd been coming to Paris for many, many years, who was then afflicted with early onset Alzheimer's disease. So we're then in the most unforgettable of cities at the same time that she's losing her ability to remember, which had a certain kind of poignancy to it. But at the same time, we were trying to enjoy things as best we could with the time that we had left. And then when I was ultimately left on my own, it was the job of trying to sort of recreate my life. And there I have to say, it was the city that kind of roared back to life and came to my rescue. So it was through these kinds of encounters and surprises that I found myself able to re-engage, to laugh again, to enjoy the urban experience, to enjoy other people, find all of the colorful characters, and ultimately led to a new page in my life and a new love in my life. And
Don't give away the ending.
Yeah.
This I like that idea because even I've been here 10 years, but there are lots of different chapters in my life, as in father, journalist, broke, like different steps. And I feel like Paris offers something for each different stage. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Even in whichever district you might be in. And I think that sounds like what you're saying as well, is that you could come here with someone, you could be here by yourself looking for the souvenirs. I think that maybe speaks not just to the, it's not just testament to the person ready to grasp it, but it also speaks of this amazing city being so sort of malleable to everybody.
Yeah, I think you're touching on something really important, which for me is that Paris, there isn't just one Paris, right? That everybody develops their own relationship with the city, and the city responds in ways that mesh with our particular needs, our stage of life, and things like that. Each of the, I guess, villages of Paris, right? Because Paris is really a collection of villages, has its own particular character, and we either fit with them well or we don't. We move to another neighborhood, and perhaps like you, I've lived in many different neighborhoods in Paris, but have really settled in the 13th, which is not considered a very elegant part of Paris.
Not yet.
Not yet, yeah.
Because each village,
it's rising.
But I mean, that's the thing. Even a step further, each village that you talk about in 20 years or 10 years' time will be serving a whole different Paris to people then.
That's right.
So it's like the eternal. Is it the eternal city or is that Rome? Rome.
People often think of Paris as being sort of eternal, especially the kind of tourist center, the hub, which doesn't change very much. The rest of Paris changes fast. This is something that the poet Charles Baudelaire speaks about. He says, the Paris changes faster than the human heart, alas. And so it's sometimes great, but it's also mixed with a kind of loss.
Yeah.
And I think that blending of gaining and discovering, but also losing, is some of what I try to capture in the book as well.
Baudelaire, he didn't really like Paris in the end, did he?
He was a malcontent in almost every area of his life, but he was less of a malcontent with Paris than with most other things.
There you go. Well, anyone who can quote from Baudelaire is always welcome on this podcast. Scott Carpenter, the book is Paris Lost and Found, a memoir of love. You'll be able to find it anywhere you look, I believe.
I think so.
And we're planning to hear more from Scott on the Earful Tower. So if you like the sound of his voice, if you like the sound of this guy, check out his book. I'll be linking to it everywhere. And I enjoyed it a lot. So thank you for spending the afternoon working through this podcast with me. And,
Thanks so much, Oliver.
And I look forward to talking more to you in the near future.
Be happy to.
And there you have it. Music, as I said, by Press Maxon. That was Scott Dominic Carpenter, his book, Paris Lost and Found, a memoir of love. I've linked to him, his Instagram, and the book in the show notes below. As for Patreon that I mentioned at the start of the episode, patreon.com/the Earful Tower. If you're already a member, you'll see that I've started to ramp things up. Recently, I recommended a brand new cafe in central Paris that nobody knows about, so much so that the owner of it has purposely not shared it on social media as he wants to fine-tune it before the hordes come. So if you want to know about these things before everybody else does, getting a Patreon membership for the Earful Tower is like having your finger on the pulse of Paris. I can't really sell it better than that. Patreon.com/the Earful Tower or Patreon.com if you prefer it with an Australian accent. Thanks to all the members. You make this thing go. Check out Scott Carpenter once again. Paris Lost and Found is his book. I hope you enjoy it. I'll be back again next week with a new episode. See you then.